Hi, welcome back, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for the last part of the Reproductive Injustice Symposium today. My name is Sandra Moyano Ariza. I am the research director here at BCRW. Before we get started, I want to thank our workshop facilitators today. And thank you again to our ESL interpreters and AV and IMEDs. I am very happy to welcome you to the closing session of the symposium, a panel discussion with Dána-Ain Davis, Ash Williams, Amaryah Armstrong, and Toni Bond, and our moderator, Beck Jordan-Young, to discuss about the current moment of reproductive justice and injustice in the United States, as well as to think of collective avenues, both in organizing and scholarship, to move reproductive justice forward. The panel is going to run for about an hour or so, and then we will have some time for Q&A. And I have the pleasure today to introduce the moderator, Beck Jordan-Young. She's the Anne Whitney Olin Professor in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at Barnard. As an interdisciplinary feminist, scientist, and science studies scholar, her work explores the reciprocal relations between science and the social hierarchies of gender, sexuality, class, and race. Her recent book, Testosterone, an authorized biography, co-authored with Katrina Karkazis, and also a volume that you can purchase, The Word Up Table, as well as Dána-Ain Davis' book, with a discount code, I've been told, so please make sure that you grab those as well. And as I was saying, Testosterone, an unauthorized biography, recipient of the Gold Medal in Science from the Independent Publisher Book Awards, that challenges popular and scientific understandings of testosterone as being the biological essence of masculinity. Among her other words and publications, she has also co-edited an issue in our very Scholar and Feminist Online about reproductive injustice, reproductive justice, and reproductive technologies. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Beck Jordan-Young.
Welcome again to the afternoon panel for this amazing Reproductive Injustice Symposium. It is an incredible honor for me to be moderating this. So to all of the other thanks that people have given today, which I'll echo, I just want to also thank the organizers for bringing me into this to be able to be even just present at this conversation with thinkers and organizers who I admire so much. I want to preserve as much time as possible for the speakers, so although their bios are extensive because they have so many accomplishments, I'm going to truncate a little. Professor Dána-Ain Davis is Professor of Urban Studies and Anthropology and Director of the Center for the Study of Women and Society at the Graduate Center of New York City's amazing public university, CUNY. She is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 5 books, the most recent being the award-winning book that launched this symposium, Reproductive Injustice, Racism, Pregnancy, and Premature Birth. Yes. Reproductive Injustice received the 2020 Honorable Mention for the Victor Turner Prize in Ethnographic Writing, was a finalist for the 2020 Prose Award given by the Association of American Publishers, and is listed as one of 7 essential books on anti-racism by New York Magazine. In this book, Davis examines medical racism in the lives of professional Black women who have given birth prematurely, offering a critical corrective to the idea that adverse birth outcomes in Black women are primarily a function of class, really complicating the integration of the different systems of power, as we've been talking about all day. She also lifts up the role that birth workers, midwives, doulas, and birth advocates play in addressing Black women's birth outcomes. Ash Williams is a Black trans abortion doula, public intellectual, and abolitionist community organizer from Fayetteville, North Carolina. For the last 5 years, Ash has been vigorously fighting to expand abortion access by funding abortions and training other people to become abortion doulas. In 2016, Ash confronted Hillary Clinton at a private fundraiser, demanding that she apologize to Black people for mass incarceration. Ash is an abortion doula. Yeah, let's give that some applause. Ash is an abortion doula with the Mountain Area Abortion Doula Collective. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Toni Bond, who has been a social justice activist for over 30 years, working to elevate the voices of Black women around issues of reproductive and sexual health. In 1994, Dr. Bond was one of the 12 founding mothers who gave birth to the concept of reproductive justice. This concept created a paradigm shift in how women of color would add their collective voices to the fight for reproductive autonomy and freedom. Dr. Bond is Associate Professor of Ethics at Methodist Theological School in Ohio. A womanist ethicist, Dr. Bond's areas of specialization include classical, Christian, and womanist ethics, gender and sexuality, reproductive health rights and justice, Black feminist methodology, and womanist theory and methodology. And our exemplary closer for the panel today is Amaryah Armstrong, Assistant Professor of Race in American Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech University. She primarily works in Black studies and political theology to explore the relationships between religion, the reproduction of race, and the senses of significance that make social orders coherent and meaningful. She has published articles on Black reproduction, Black studies, and political theology, and is currently finishing her first book, Domestic Theologies: Romances of Black Redemption After Reconstruction. The book's readings of Black domestic literature after Reconstruction show how theological grammars of knowledge, kinship, and desire animate crises of Black political legitimacy, belonging, and governance. So one last thing before I turn it over to the panelists, I'm going to just let you know the invitation for the panel. We asked for them to share some of their most important takeaways of their research and activist work, address the current moment of reproductive in/justice, and offer ways that we can collectively move forward. So please welcome Dr. Dána-Ain Davis.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Oh, my goodness. What a wonderful, wonderful moment today, in this moment, because we have lots of reasons to not be happy. But I am happy, though, to be here with you. And I want to thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm so deeply grateful for everyone who has played a role in making today's event a reality. And I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Barnard Center for Research on Women, to Olivia Cummings, to Hope Dector, to Janet Jakobsen, to Sophie Kreitzberg, Premila Nattison, and Tammy Navarro, who is no longer at Barnard, but still walks with me in my heart. I want to thank Sydney and Hannah and Sandra. I can't see you all because I'm wearing my reading glasses. I want to thank CQ and Brandon, Beck, Jordan. I want to thank my amazing panelists, sister, people, persons. And I want to thank Dorothy Roberts. Some of you I've had the privilege of collaborating with. Many of you I have not. But I want to also acknowledge, as did Premila, the work of the labor of those who are often in the shadows, the people who set up and clean up, which is what my grandmothers did. They cleaned places like this. And I just feel truly honored to be safe in the warmth of everyone's engagement with my work and the unwavering commitment to justice. I am really honored beyond measure and give gratitude to those who come before me and the powers that guide us. Today, I want to start off by sharing a poem. I think I don't always follow instructions, so I didn't really write what she asked me. That's what a good Black feminist does. So I want to share a poem called Listen, You Can Hear the Mothers Crying in the Universe, a Black feminist poet's requiem for our Black warrior, Toni Bond. And it's a poem by Kara Page, who I call my cousin. She calls me hers too, so it's reciprocal. Listen, you can hear the mothers crying in the universe. We do not cower at the possibilities of those who will target Black women for reproducing. Black women who will be blamed for creating generations of burdens and social warfare on the state. We will not witness and watch the slow genocide of our Black children. We will instead consume the murderers with watchful eyes, witful tongues, and hungry hearts, transforming our own idea of justice by giving voice to our lives, our intuition, our knowing. Listen, you can hear the Black mothers crying in the universe. We are the bone collectors, the memory makers, the root workers, the mind benders. And we name Black feminist doctrine, giving bone and flesh to the forgotten and daring to witness our coming home again and again. This poem, I think, underscores the enduring struggles that are faced by Black women and birthing people who are so often, as Dorothy Roberts shared with us earlier, so frequently blamed for societal ills. Yet, we remain steadfast in the pursuit of justice. I think the poem also reminds us of the responsibility that we hold to give voice to our lives, our intuitions, and our experiences. We are bone collectors, we are memory makers, we are root workers, weaving a Black feminist doctrine to honor the forgotten. And I have recited this poem a few times with the same urgency in the year that I first read it in 2016. And I recited it then to remember, and now to remember Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Aina Stanley Jones, Rakia Boyd, Maya Hall, Marlene Pinnock, and countless others whose lives were tragically cut short. It's the same urgency with which we must face the harrowing statistics like the stark racial reproductive unevenness in the United States, and the same urgency of adverse racial reproductive outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa, in Brazil, thank you, Nisset Falou, in Europe, among other locations. So recently, what I've been doing is exploring how racism operates on Black and brown bodies in a global context. And this examination involves unpacking the interplay of global processes with historical racism to amplify the geographies of racial and class differences in reproduction. While we are very familiar with the reproductive policing of Black bodies in the US, there are absolutely transnational reproductive connections that I think demand our attention. Black reproductive bodies exist in the web of imperial reproductive control, whether through forced C-sections on Somalian women, refugee women in Kenya, or the experiences of individuals like Penda Sai in Senegal, whose life has been shaped by the vitriol of anti-abortionist crusades led by religious clerics. Her experience exemplified the atrocious outcomes that anti-abortion politics have wrought on Black and brown-bodied people in the US. Penda gave birth in her room to a child conceived out of wedlock. She was ashamed and no one knew she was pregnant. She hemorrhaged and underwent emergency surgery and was reported by the police to the police by medical staff for suspected infanticide. And then she was incarcerated. And so we clearly see, I think, stark resonances between this case and that of Regina McKnight that Dorothy talked about earlier. Just as in the United States, where obstetric racism persists, Brazil too sees Black women experiencing obstetric racism, leading to avoidable obstetric deaths and maternal disparities due to anti-Blackness. This pattern extends to Afro-Brazilian people who have migrated to Portugal, where they face subtle yet traumatizing racism in healthcare. The case of Mayra was reported in a Brazilian paper and it animates the similarities of racism, subtle though they may be, by Black and brown-bodied people. "Ah, another Brazilian," said the nurse. "You are a mix of races, so you won't be able to give birth to your baby. Surrender to the fact that you are having a C-section. Don't you see how many cesareans there are in Brazil? That's because you are a mix of races. Your uterus is very bad because you are a mix of races." No matter where Black people live, anti-Black racism has left us with limited access to care, differential outcomes, birth and otherwise, stemming from a history of social and economic exploitation, racial science, and stereotypes. The rise of obstetrics and hospital-centered care has redefined reproductive governance and access and created hierarchies that mirror past impulses that also led to relocating childbirth to clinical settings. We can look at cross-border reproductive care from highly regulated European countries and Australia and see that repro travelers' decisions to circumvent restrictions in their home country, such as prohibitions on egg donation, the non-anonymity of donors, or age restrictions for using assisted reproductive technology. Repro travel to repro hubs, as they are called, are growing in African countries, with the highest number of IVF centers in Egypt. There are 52, in Ghana where there's 8, in Kenya where there's 5, Nigeria where there's 12, and South Africa where there's 37. But the exploitation of poor and low-income people, of course, increases the possibilities of trafficking in reproductive exploitation as people consider surrogacy for income generation. So I simply share these insights, which I know many of you already know, simply to encourage us to look beyond our own borders and recognize that Black women and birthing people across the globe face similar challenges. In the spirit of activists like Frances Beale, who understood the interconnectedness of anti-imperialism, socialism, and anti-colonialism, we can and should be coordinating our efforts to build a global reproductive justice movement, to strengthen those connections. In the context of global conversations on war, decolonization, and gender, we can learn from reproductive activists in other countries and share our experiences. Our histories may differ, but our outcomes align. We are dying, we are killed, and sometimes we are not killed, but we survive with pain. The chaos surrounding Black reproduction in the United States obviously encompasses issues of abortion, maternal mortality, morbidity, and mothering rooted in historical injustices. The transnational trends that I've briefly alluded to and discussed, I think raises the transnational trends that I've briefly raised emphasize that the U.S. reproductive health crisis is actually a global reproductive health crisis, with birth outcomes and experiences of Black women and birthing people in the United States receive most of the attention The experiences of Black women and birthing people across the diaspora, I think, are frequently overlooked. And so thinking about race, racism, and reproduction among the African diaspora actually led me to co-host the first ever European conference on race and reproduction that was held this past June, where we explored maternal health issues among Black women in Europe and beyond. We had scholars and reproductive health and justice workers from the US, from Scotland, from Britain, France, Italy, Brazil, Geneva, Switzerland, Spain, South Africa, Australia, Mayotte, and Amsterdam. And what we learned there was that the struggle for reproductive justice clearly knows no geographical boundaries. And thinking through the global challenges faced by Black women and birthing people, we need to continue uniting across borders to address those challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Also, thank you to Brandon and CQ for doing the interpretation today. Thank you to Dr. Toni Bond Leonard. Thank you to the entire Barnard team. Thank you to Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Young. Shout out to the students, and also shout out to the folks who are not here because they're observing the general strike in support of our Palestinian siblings. So I'd like to share some important takeaways of my research and my organizing work. I'd like to then address the current moment of reproductive injustice, and then I would like to offer ways that we can collectively move forward. So I came to reproductive justice as a framework through resisting police violence in my community, through political education about the violence of the prison industrial complex, and through my own experiences as a Black transgender person accessing abortions and gender-affirming care in so-called North Carolina. I came to RJ work by way of being in community with Southeast Asian refugees, Palestinians, undocumented people, anti-Zionist Jews, and poor and middle-class anti-racist white people. For the past 7 years, I've shown up on the front lines across movements, touting the RJ framework and being a broken record about that third principle of reproductive justice. I've used RJ to connect to my students, to other abortion havers, to incarcerated people, and to other trans people experiencing prison industrial complex violence. I also came to the RJ framework as someone who is experiencing the unending impacts of family separation. I haven't always had the robust language that the framework affords me today, and I'm grateful for a framework that has allowed me to show up having experienced intersecting and non-collapsible forms of oppression, whereas other justice movements that I've organized on behalf of forced me to leave parts of myself outside of the rooms. The RJ framework allows me to critically interrogate my positionality in ways that don't flatten or negate parts of who I am and issues that are important to people that I care about and people who are a part of me. In the vein of resisting the enclosures of the law and the asylum that is the medical industrial complex, as RJ requires us to do, I have always been invested in Black and Indigenous-led forms of resistance that prop up people power instead of police, punishment, and imprisonment. Medicalized violence and transphobia facilitate trans death and suicide, making those things matters of reproductive oppression too. Dr. Dorothy Roberts writes in Killing the Black Body that true reproductive freedom requires a living wage, universal health care, and the abolition of prisons. This definition can be extrapolated to consider how both murders of queer and trans people and the administrative, state, and medicalized violences that we encounter are also reproductive justice issues. This understanding is crucial as the rates of state and community violence against queer and trans people are exacerbated by a lack of access to gender-affirming healthcare, employment, housing, and social supports. I'm able to talk about these things in this way because of the reproductive justice framework. When I was on probation earlier this year, the punishment that I was giving for allegedly assaulting a police officer, a crime that I did not commit, I co-wrote a piece for Critical Resistance, an org that I've long admired and learned from, about how RJ is a vital field for prison industrial complex abolition. And for the past 2 years, I've been more closely following the work of other abolitionists interrupting criminalization, like Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie, who continue to remind me of the importance of centering community care within this landscape of criminalization. Reproductive justice requires abolition. And another part of my organizing framework is direct action. And so I found ways to marry this tactic and this way of life of direct action with the reproductive justice framework, yielding actions like the 2016 confrontation of Hillary Clinton. I wanted to put her words in front of her. She called Black and brown youth super predators, and she props up things like the 3 strikes rule, police, and imprisonment. And I thought that it was really critical during a time when the left propped her up as this bastion of racial justice. I wanted to remind folks, or to encourage people to ask, which Hillary are we going to get? Are we going to get the Hillary of 1994 who propped up the crime bill? Or are we getting this new version, this racial justice Hillary? I believe that birth and abortion is a binary created by the medical industrial complex and white supremacy. And when I'm training other people to become abortion doulas, one of the first things that we're establishing is the connection between birth and abortion. And I'm so grateful to the abortion doulas that taught me that abortion is a type of birth. To address the current moment of reproductive injustice, I have to remind folks that today, Palestinians are calling on the world to strike in solidarity with their ongoing struggle for liberation from Israeli occupation. I consider this call to action to be a reproductive justice call to action. RJ teaches that controlling people's bodies is the pathway to controlling entire communities. And RJ requires us to acknowledge the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. And it refers to the mass displacement and dispossession of Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Before the Nakba, Palestine was a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. RJ encourages us to bravely and courageously condemn and decry Israel as an apartheid state. My reproductive justice includes women and other gender-expansive people under occupation. As ARC Southeast, an abortion fund in Atlanta, Georgia, so bravely stated last week, there can be no justice, peace, or reproductive freedom underneath colonial occupation. As an RJ organization, we know that notions of bodily autonomy, self-determination, and access to healthcare are all made possible when one lives within are not made possible when one lives within an open-air prison under apartheid. Do you realize, ARC asks, that RJ demands access and pathways to bodily autonomy for all people, including our Palestinian siblings and family members? I could say so much more about the tumultuous landscape of criminalization in North Carolina. I could talk about how we've always had one of the longest waiting periods in the country. I could talk about that 12-week ban on abortion. But I think it's imperative to use this moment to talk about the need for a ceasefire and an end to the Israeli occupation. Our mourning Palestinian siblings have asked us to support them today and every day by taking off of work or school and to join a Palestinian-led rally, by having hard conversations with family and friends about the genocide being carried out in Gaza. And please, call it genocide. Be as brave as you can be. RJ says that we have to tell the truth. RJ says that paradigmatic shifts happen when we tell the truth. Join a local organization in support of Palestinian liberation. Learn about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Wear a flag or a keffiyeh in solidarity with Palestinian liberation. And organize on and off campus towards bodily autonomy and self-determination for all people. Lastly, I'd like to offer some ways that we can collectively move forward. RJ will be reached when all people have the necessary resources and social supports to make decisions for themselves and their families in all areas of their lives. And so moving forward, I believe that we should all focus more on criminalization, as it is the mechanism that illuminates many different forms of reproductive oppression. Reproductive justice longs for an abolitionist future. In that future, every person would have the things that they need to make the decisions and support their families. And reproductive justice will be achieved when our biggest abolitionist dreams come true.
Greetings, everyone. As my colleagues before me, I want to thank, and I won't go through everybody because you all have done a stellar job of thanking everybody. But thank you to the Barnard Center for Women and Gender for inviting me to be here with you all today. And thank you to Q and Brandon for interpreting for us, and to all of the staff of the center and the volunteers and the students who helped make this possible. And it's always an amazing opportunity to be in community with folks that I admire, like Dorothy Roberts and Dr. Davis and Ash and Amaryah. It's just a privilege to be here. This moment that we are in, I am reminded of when we all came together in '94, the 12 of us, in Chicago at that conference sponsored by the Ms. Foundation for Women and the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance. And it was a conference, and I'm so glad you brought into the room, Ash, the Clinton administration. It was a conference to talk about the Clinton administration's proposal on universal health care reform. And they sent a representative to present to about 150 reproductive health and rights activists on this proposal, where they excluded reproductive and sexual health care. So imagine being that representative, talking to this group of reproductive and sexual health and rights advocates about a healthcare reform proposal that didn't include provisions for the folks in the room or the people in the communities that we worked with. And the rationale that they gave for excluding it was because they thought that they'd be able to pass it through the Republican Party. Well, we know that didn't work out. And so, as we looked around this conference, we realized something else, that we were the only 12 Black women in the room. And our colleagues were very much so concerned about abortion being in the proposal. And we knew that abortion, while very important in the lives of Black women, was one aspect of a plethora of reproductive and sexual health issues confronting Black women. And so we did what Black women do. We caucused. And it was there that the beginnings of this theoretical framework that we now know of as reproductive and sexual justice, and note that I'm calling it reproductive and sexual justice because as this framework has grown and been expounded upon, we know that it is not just about the ability to reproduce, but it is also about bodily autonomy that includes sexual pleasure. And so we speak of it now in terms of reproductive and sexual justice. I'm reminded that we're at a similar pivotal political moment where we are being pushed to think even more broadly in terms of this intersectional analysis that grounds, and I call it RSJ. Because we are in a moment where we are experiencing attacks on democracy, and I put that in quotes, in unlike any other way than we have seen. When we think about attacks on critical race theory, when we think about attacks on affirmative action, when we think about the overturning of Roe, and when that happened, a lot of people said they never expected it to happen in their lifetime. But folks in the reproductive justice movement did expect it to happen. Because for years, and we knew that attempts to overturn Roe started the day after Roe was decided in '73. But we also understood that Roe was never a reality for Black, Indigenous communities of color anyway, particularly with the Hyde Amendment. But we also knew that even with the overturning of Roe, this moment is calling for us to make the connections. Because you see, when you attack critical race theory, when you say academics, teachers, professors can't talk about the history of this country, it means we can't talk about the horrors upon enslaved Black women and how enslaved Black women's bodies were used to produce the labor for the slave economy. We can't talk about the ways in which Native and Indigenous women's bodies were terrorized and how children were taken away from Native and Indigenous communities. We can't talk about the ways in which Puerto Rican women's bodies were experimented on with forms of contraception. We are in a moment where we are confronted with some hard truths, even about our movements, the reproductive health, rights, and justice movements. And one I'd like to especially lift up, and which is where I have been focusing my work, is at the intersections of religion and reproductive and sexual justice. For far too long, we have allowed right-wing religious conservatives to claim the moral high ground. We have got to reclaim the moral high ground. Because until we deal with the fact that much of these pieces of restrictive legislation are undergirded by religion, by religious notions around morality, about how we live our lives, we will continue to lose in this struggle. We have to courageously reclaim the moral high ground and drive home the fact that there is supposed to be a separation between church and state, and to highlight the fact that these efforts to overturning Roe v. Wade and attacks on critical race theory and affirmative action and attacks on trans health care are all centered around a notion of a one religion state, that Christianity is the one and only religion. And that's not true. And so we have to stop being afraid to talk about this thing called religion. One of the important pieces of my dissertation research, I did my dissertation, I collected the oral narratives of Black Protestant women around the impact of oppressive theological teachings on their reproductive and sexual health and their decisions. And the stories that I heard were heartbreaking of how women still carry with them today the guilt they feel about having a teenage pregnancy, about having an abortion, about still hearing about people having to stand before their church congregation and confess their sin of having sex before marriage, of people saying that they felt like they let God down, of people conflating guilt and shame. And the impact of that is that many of those women that I talked to are still walking around feeling as if they let God down. What does that mean, right? That people are walking around with this carrying this internalized shame and guilt of letting God down, and saying that they feel like they're not worthy of love from God, that God is disappointed in them. And that is directly connected to oppressive theological teachings, which is directly connected to this form of Christian exceptionalism that we see flourishing in this country today. And I might add, that is finding its way across the world. And so I think our charge for now, when I think about the future of reproductive and sexual justice, I'm hopeful because this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to think very expansively about ways to counter attacks on democracy, in quotes, and to broaden our analysis, and to highlight the fact that issues of reproductive and sexual justice are the only issues that are caught up in this debate around morality. If you got a toothache and you need root canal, they are not going to ask you about your moral position. If you have heart palpitations and you need to go to the emergency room, nobody's going to question you about your religious belief or your moral stance. They're going to give you an EKG and all other sorts of blood work and so forth and so on. But it is only with issues of reproductive and sexual health rights and justice where morality issues come into play. And I think it's high time for our movements to stop being afraid to have this conversation about religion and to bring it to the forefront and highlight the fact that anti-choice conservatives were never concerned about religion until '73, until the 70s, when they wanted to ensure that they could maintain segregation. And they realized that they could organize people around an issue like abortion. So I think it's high time for us to stop being afraid to talk about religion. And I want to close with, let's look at this as an opportunity. Let's stop thinking about what's wrong with the world through the lens of reproductive and sexual justice, and let's start thinking about the world that we want to create. That's a more positive lens. I think that's the next step for us in this reproductive and sexual justice movement. And also, if we are going to have any chance at righting the wrongs of reproductive and sexual injustice, we have to begin to look at this through a much more positive lens, filled with hope and thoughts about what the world looks like that we want to create. Thank you.
Hi. It's so interesting seeing things from this side of the room. I just want to start by thanking BCRW for the invitation, and especially give thanks to Olivia Cummings for extending the initial invitation, and kind of piggybacking off of my other panelists, all the reproductive labor that's gone into making this event possible. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of things that could go around. So I guess coming after Toni feels very serendipitous, because I also am talking about religion. And I study religion and culture, and the relationship between Black studies and political theology, and many times people are like, what's political theology about? And so I was hoping to kind of give a definition of political theology that hopefully could be kind of useful and usable for reproductive justice and thinking about that. So 2 ways that my work has taken up questions of reproductive and also sexual justice, I appreciate Toni pointing that out, is around the theological ideas that animate the concept of fetal personhood and the theological ideas that have showed up in places like the Dobbs decision. So Alito gives reference to this concept of ordered liberty, and I've done a lot of tracking down. Where does that concept come from in this kind of Christian exceptionalist heritage, and I think a white Christian kind of history is often what's funding a lot of these concepts that end up in the laws. So I think it's interesting to think about how theological concepts and legal concepts kind of share a history. But what I want to talk about today is thinking about a sense of theological reproduction, and what would it mean to think about theology in terms of reproduction? One of my favorite definitions of theology comes from a philosopher of religion, Jakob Taubes, and he talks about theology as something that arrives in times of crisis, when a mythic configuration is breaking down, and theology is used to renew that myth and renew the kind of symbols that power that myth. And so if we want to think about reproductive injustice and anti-Blackness as predicated on a kind of mythic configuration, how could we read these instances of reproductive injustice as tied up with this political theological attempt to renew the significance of an anti-Black order? And I guess one way I think we can think about this kind of mythic configuration is in terms of redemption and damnation. So I, in my work, talk about an idea of racial order as being a racial order of redemption, and that order depends on a sense of damnation as well in order to give redemption its meaning and coherence. And so when we look at things like the kind of carceral punishment and violence and force that Black people and other people of color are subject to, that's not just producing that violence. Obviously it is producing that, but it's also kind of producing an excess of symbols and significance that's being taken up by conservatives and neoliberals to kind of justify the political order that they want to use. So I think it's interesting to think about enslaved people's reproduction, not just in terms of something like reproductive labor and reproducing a laboring class of people, but also the fact that they're reproducing a symbolic power, and because so much of anti-Blackness and anti-Black governance depends on perception and interpreting people's behaviors and reading these markers, what's also being reproduced is a symbolic power. So how might we think about the management of race and the management of reproduction as about this control of symbols and symbolic authority? And then I guess one more thing I wanted to point to was just theological ideas of the image that I think are at work oftentimes in things like both these anti-abortion advertisements that we've seen with things like, the most dangerous place for a child is the womb, or for a Black child is the womb, things like that. But also, as in Dr. Davis's book points out, even in things like kind of local attempts to encourage maternal, to encourage mothers to have stronger children. These kind of racialized images are at work, and they're educating the viewers racially at the same time. So thinking about how both conservative and kind of neoliberal uses of the image and racial images serve to not just create a narrative, but also to educate us in this kind of symbolic order that maintains anti-Blackness and reproductive injustice. And the last thing I wanted to point to is just the significance of the child to reproductive injustice, and also to movements for reproductive and sexual justice. And I find it helpful to think about the child in terms of the figure of the child and the flesh of the child. And so in queer studies, there's a strand of queer studies that has this critique of this idea of redemptive or reproductive futurity, and how the figure of the child gets called upon to justify kind of anti-queer politics. But I think something interesting that keeps coming up in this room is that same calling upon the figure of the child is used to justify these very carceral and invasive violations of Black communities and families, and thinking about Dr. Roberts pointing to CPS not needing any warrant. They can just use the figure of the child as justification for that kind of invasion. So how, as this figure of the child in this kind of redemptive political imagination being called upon to authorize this anti-Black violence and reproductive violence, and then also how this sense of the flesh of the child is, I think, what reproductive justice calls us to attend to. So thinking about what is the actual effect of these forces of violence on literal children, if we think not just about the fantasies of children and the kind of projections of children that are used to maintain certain senses of order through gender and race, when we have to think about what is, the singularity of this person, and what is their story, and what is their sense of identity, and what is it that they need to flourish. When we have to actually attend to that, I think that kind of transforms our sense of what is significant and how it's significant in a way that troubles, I think, this redemptive logic. And I guess just to get a little personal before I go, I wanted to think about this kind of global expansion of a kind of Christian vision that I think is shaping a lot of, as Dr. Davis points to, like global reproductive injustice. And I come from a conservative evangelical Black family, and it's been interesting to me to watch the ways that Black conservatives and Black Christians have been increasingly mobilized in service of reproductive injustice, and trying to think about what is what's desirable about this? Why is this an attractive way of being, given how kind of vile and anti-Black so much of this is? And I think one element of this is how much narratives of what would remedy anti-Blackness are caught up in a redemptive imagination, and that's often very reproductive. So this idea that by birthing, future Black doctors or lawyers, that's going to be what overcomes anti-Blackness. And I think that's something this kind of conservative strand of Black people and Black Christians draw on to kind of create a racial justice narrative around reproductive injustice. And so I think this sense of redemptive futurity is also important for us to think with as progressives and leftists. How might we kind of, create a sense of the future or ways of thinking about the future that don't rely on this kind of redemptive narrative to justify the sense of significance of the work that we're doing, or to kind of justify the futures we want to imagine? What would it mean to kind of attend to the singularity of the now and the singularity of the people and families and children that demand reproductive justice without calling for that kind of redemptive promise and the desire for fulfillment that brings. So that's, I think where I'll end. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janet Jakobsen. I'm co-director of BCRW. Beck Jordan-Young apologizes, but there's been an emergency with a very close friend of hers all day that has meant that she's had to step away. And I was scheduled for closing remarks, and I was already thinking that this has been a remarkable day and that I wouldn't do that, but I will depend on all of you for some questions for panelists, and then as a closing, ask everybody for some last word that they want to give when we come to the end here. So we are on to questions. We have the microphone here, and we're looking to our community.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I'm with the New York Abortion Access Fund, and just really grateful to be in space and learn from you all. Ash, I participated in one of your virtual doula trainings a few years ago, and so much about that training really complicated my relationship and understanding of the RJ framework. So this question's for everybody, but it builds off, Ash, what you started, right, as a question to Dr. Roberts about human rights, right? So I'm curious to hear all of your perspectives, Ash, if you'd like to start, particularly about the limitations of centering RJ in a human rights framework, and where, if not in a human rights framework, where do we go? What is, moving forward? And then curious, particularly thinking about, the history as well, like just in general, honoring the history of RJ while continuing to push it forward and the complications there. So yeah, open to anyone, but perhaps Ash, if you'd like to start.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for being part of the training. Okay. Remember when in the training, when we're going through the principles of reproductive justice, a part of what I am doing there is I ask participants, can these things exist not as rights? What would it mean to give people this shit off the strength of they deserve it to live? And so one of the things that I'm interested in is just thinking about the principles outside of the rights frameworks, because I do believe there is a way to talk about how we deserve to be able to have a baby, not have a baby, and determine the conditions, and to live free from harm. I think that those things, for me and Black trans people who live in the South, for example, it is possible that we can focus on those things without being limited by rights. I am concerned about who the legal and ethical formations of rights might leave out. And I'll just pause right there.
Anybody else? Anybody else want to respond on this question on the rights framework and how to think about it, Donna?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, once it's on, it's really on.
It's really on, thank you. I absolutely concur with what Ash has said, and when you were speaking, what I was thinking about is that the limitation of rights come with the same limitations as the idea of citizenship. And rights are afforded to citizens, and if you're not one, then you don't have any. And I think we need to rethink, this is a bigger question, but it's we need to rethink ideas of nation state. We need to rethink ideas of citizenship. We need to rethink ideas of rights. So I agree with you. I think you used the term beyond rights earlier, which is something a number of people are thinking about. What are the other ways to be in the world? You're a human. And we do deserve water that's not toxic. We deserve houses. We deserve not to live in places that are near medical incinerators. We deserve to not be in open air prisons. We deserve not to have prisons be the primary function, economic driver of our communities. And a lot of all of the things that I think I just said are very much linked to the power and the control of the nation state.
It's on. Okay. I, for one, appreciate always the ability and openness to interrogate even our own theoretical frameworks. I think we always have to be doing that. But I would encourage people, and oftentimes when we talk about reproductive and sexual justice, we always sit with it resting on human rights, but it also rests on Black feminist thought and theory too. That gives us our intersectionality. I hear the challenges with rights. I hear the fact that it's really hard to hold this country accountable to the treaties that have been signed at the international level, right, when we've only ratified one. But the whole idea with us pulling from the human rights framework was what I said during my talk. Rather than sit with what's wrong, what does the world of possibility look like? And as we were thinking about what is this world that we want to create, what would it look like? And Donna, you said it, we all deserve clean water. We all deserve fair and living wages. We all deserve, to live in adequate housing, more than adequate housing. We all deserve all of these things. And as we were thinking about where is that stated? And if you look at the human rights framework, if you look at all of the principles, you can find aspects of all of the world that we're saying we would like to create in the human rights framework. Now, what do we call it? Something else? I don't know. I'm not opposed to that, but I think the thinking was not, like I said, not. And I hear you, because when I think about how historically we were saying pro-choice. And we interrogated the use of the term pro-choice, that, well, who has choice and who doesn't? Choice implies access to a marketplace of options that not everybody has. Human rights implies, as we have said, right? But I guess my question is, if not that, then what else? What's our other option? What framework can we use to talk about this world we want to create and what that world should include?
Donna, you look like you want to talk. All right, Amaryah? No. You're good? Okay, all right, next question. Yes, Nisette.
Hello, thank you for the amazing day and panel. So my name is Nisette Falou. And I just want to take note that there's no coincidence this is a Black panel. So where reproductive justice is an anti-racist, right? We need that anti-racist lens, which always hasn't been and still isn't. But then it hasn't always been and still isn't from an anti-heteronormative lens. And so I wanted to pick your brain about how do we think about, on a very grassroots level, the solidarity needed between Black heterosexual women and folks and Black queer folks, right, for reproductive justice broadly, right, not just as we're thinking about, for example, in the challenges of my work, where the word birthing is safe, right, in terms of using birthing versus maternal, right, in the community. Or other terms, right? Chest versus breast. So just wanted to kind of think on a very grassroots level, right? How can we think about the kind of solidarity that we need, that needs to then galvanize, right, so that even social media is less toxic, right, between the communities that we need to feel safe within as Black queer folks on reproductive justice.
Excellent, thank you. I think this is open to anyone who wants to start.
Hello? Okay. I guess one thing I wanted to say is I do think that Black heterosexuals are very inundated with a redemptive sense of reproduction. And I think a lot of that plays a role in a lot of, as far as I've seen, the kind of defensiveness and anxiety that some cis heterosexual Black women bring to questions of gender expansive people and their pregnancies, and thinking about other forms of kinship and family. And so I wonder like what kind of work could be done to kind of unlearn those narratives about, kind of securing a redemptive sense of Black love or Black family through heterosexual reproduction.
Anybody else?
And you're talking about specifically at the grassroots. And so when you say specifically at the grassroots, I'm thinking, right, grassroots groups who are working in community. Like, how do you have that conversation, right? How do you create those teachable moments, right? Or those educatable moments where you can be in dialogue with people in the community, like if you do a town hall or something like that, or how do you talk with people at community groups? How do you talk with people in the community? How do you take advantage of teachable moments in families, with friends, your community? That's where is that what you're talking about? Yeah. Okay. I wonder, and I'm just wondering, I'm running a couple of things. One, sometimes I think we want everybody to get on board. And follow me with this. The same thing happened and continues to happen around the issue of abortion and health rights and trying to do health rights and justice work in the communities. We're not going to get everybody to get on board. And this happens, I think, especially, I know for me, trying to do work at the intersection of religion and reproductive and sexual justice, I'm not going to get everybody on board. I don't know that I want everybody on board. Who I want are the people who are open to those educatable and teachable moments, who are open in mind and heart to have this dialogue, right, where we can learn from each other. I think that's the place that I think in the spaces that we have to seek out in the grassroots community, and they do exist. At the same time, I agree with you about heteronormativity in the Black community. And also, because it doesn't have to be either or, right? And also, because I think that in some respects there may be some miscommunication going on too. Because I think, and have you been to the Proctor Conference? Okay. There's this thing called the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. It's big in the Black church community. And it's where the quote, progressive, and I say in quotes, progressive Black religious scholars and leaders congregate every February. And they talk, they have a very, left liberal lens, except there is tension, right, around discussing LGBT plus issues, right? And I think as I watch this tension, that there's this miscommunication. I feel like people who are open are being closed-minded in hearing that the desire is for them to be erased. That's what I feel like I think I'm hearing, right? And on the part of LGBT plus religious leaders, I'm hearing, I feel like they're hearing they're not being recognized, or that their existence is not being acknowledged, right? So I feel like there's this disconnect too. I don't know if I'm making sense, but there have been, I feel like we need to have this courageous conversation. I don't know what that looks like, but I feel like we need to have a courageous conversation where we come to this very open to hearing what everybody has to say. And again, understanding everybody's not going to be at the table. And again, I don't know that we want everybody at the table. We only want those people who are coming from a place of really wanting to have the courageous conversation. I have been asked sometimes when I do my presentations, and I say women and pregnant capable persons, okay? I have been asked not to say women in my presentations. I push back, and here is why. I push back because I say, well, I identify as woman. So to ask me not to include the term woman in my presentation, in a sense, you're asking me to invisibilize myself and the lived experiences and history of Black women in this country. I can't do it, and I won't do it. But what I will do is always be in a space of trying to continuously learn and trying to include inclusive language in my presentation. But what I won't do is invisibilize myself. And I don't think that that's what we're asking people to do. At least I hope that's not what we're asking people to do. I think we have to be in the space of trying to figure out how do we have this conversation in the most expansive way as possible to ensure that we're being as inclusive as possible. Because the pathway to liberation isn't the suppression of anybody else. So how do we do that? And I think we just haven't had the space to have the conversation, and I don't know that sometimes we've even had the courage to have the conversation. And y'all can be mad at me later.
I was just gonna add that transphobia is a form of reproductive oppression. And transphobia and transmisogyny, it facilitates the deaths of trans people. I think that's important, or I feel like perhaps that's a starting point, perhaps. And then another thing that I want to add is that I feel like something has happened in the last month or the last week. And one of the things that I have learned from others is this distinction that's important about how for some heterosexual Black women, like femininity is denied to them, actually. Womanhood, womanness, it's denied to them, to Black people, to people of color, to people who are not white, to people who are disabled. There's a denial there. And so I really appreciate the ways that queer and trans people and cis people have brought that up as a way to critically interrogate what you're talking about. I know that reproductive justice is about everybody, and when we talk about including trans people, that makes me a little like, what? Like, we're already there. We don't need to be included. We need to be given space. We need to be listened to and taken seriously, but we don't need to be included. We need expansion, not inclusion.
We have time for one more question. And okay, right here.
Thanks so much for putting this on to Barnard. It's my first time here. and to the speakers who've just been phenomenal. My question is for Ash, and something you said that really struck me as new was the description of abortion as a birth. And I would love if you could expand on that, and I will try and make sure that I can do one of your trainings if they're available. I'm not trying to skip ahead, but I would love to hear more.
Thank you.
So Ash, and then I'll ask everybody for last comment.
When I am saying that abortion is a type of birth, I am trying to deflate this big binary that's been created. And so I'm speaking in a few different ways. I'm speaking like figuratively and literally. And so one aspect, medically, when we're talking about birth and abortion, one of the reasons that it's not a binary is I actually want y'all to think back to a time when the abortions and the births were happening like in the same part of the hospital. And then if you know your abortion history, right, we see abortion marginalized, like down the hallway, same hospital. And then we see the further marginalization of abortion out of the hospital entirely. That's why we have abortion clinics. And so I think that the binary is reinforced by white supremacy in that way, but we're talking about a procedure that the same providers do the work. And then we're also talking about like medically as it relates to misoprostol and mifepristone. These drugs are life-saving drugs for pregnant people who are having abortions and having babies. And so I know that there's less of a binary because of that. Also, shout out to like the midwives who've reminded me that they don't call it miscarriage, that they actually call it spontaneous abortion. Because miscarriage is a layman's term. And so when I return to the history, I'm reminded of the ways that there has been this forced separation between abortion and birth. When I think of the happening of abortion and birth, I'm also thinking of it as a process, like a process that has like a beginning and an end in some ways. And so all of those things have helped me to think really critically about the lack of a binary between abortion and birth. And I also want to add that I also think of it as abortion is like is so disenfranchised as a choice. The way that people celebrate having babies, I believe that because of this binary, we actually see people not wanting to celebrate abortion. But a lot of folks in the movement have tried to talk about what it would mean to approach abortion in the ways that we approach birth. Perhaps it's not by way of celebration, but it is, or it should be about care and support, right? When we're talking about abortions and birthing babies, we're talking about a process that people deserve care and support through. And so when I say that, I'm trying to illuminate that as well.
So, Amaryah, are you willing to start our rundown? We'll go the opposite way.
Sure.
All right, thank you.
And this is just some closing remarks.
Yes, whatever you want to say.
I guess I just want to say thanks again for the invitation, and I really appreciate and respect my panelists so much, and Dr. Roberts' talk was amazing. Yeah, and I guess one thing I've been thinking, or why I feel so interested in questions of symbol and myth, is because that's another place of vitality. And I think thinking about how Black spirituality can kind of be captured and dispossessed and accumulated through things like this kind of Christian conservative politics and this kind of Christian vision of order. That's another way of thinking about how Black life and Black reproduction is stolen.
Thank you, that's great.
So listening to you, Ash, you have me thinking about like takeaways for me, right? Thank you for holding this symposium, and it's always a joy to hear Dorothy Roberts. And I thank you for, talking, how you just talked about abortion, because it took me, having ran an abortion fund, I'm thinking about how people would say to me, it's such a relief. I feel such a sense of a relief, right? And, you know, celebration. I've had 4 abortions, and after every abortion, I would go celebrate at Burger King. That was my celebration. Go have me a Whopper and some fries. Because it was a sense of, I'm serious, it was a sense of relief, right? Carrying this weight. And it was such relief, and I felt like, I'm going to go celebrate and have me a hamburger and some French fries. So thank you for that. Thank you for putting it in that, and naming, right? Naming it, because I never thought of it that way. And the other takeaway that I leave this, this event with is, Donna, thinking about your work in your book. And I've been sitting here thinking, where would I place it, right, along the RJ pillars, right? And there's, I remember in talking with you about it, one thing you said to me with your research about how the people you talked to were never fully informed about what the cost would be, right? And so I've been sitting here thinking about that's so much in the third pillar, right, of the social and economic supports that families need to thrive, that I'm sitting with that, thinking about where I'm situating your work and your book, and that what does that really mean, that people are not given full information about what it would mean to care for these children that they're going to have. That's, yeah, so now I'm going to be thinking about that all day. Thank you. While we're eating, thank you. Yes. That's what I'm thinking about.
I would like to end by saying that if you or anyone you know needs help funding an abortion, please let me know. Any person, anywhere, any point in gestation, I will help you fund your abortion. I will help you get connected to an abortion doula where you are in time and space. I also want to encourage people to respond and react to these abortion bans and restrictions by doing just that, by funding other people's abortions, by helping people get to their appointments, and by helping people access abortion pills, as well as information about self-managing abortion.
My last comments are first to say thank you to each and every one of you, and you. I think there are 2 things I want to say. One is, I had my first abortion when I was 16. I think my mother went with me, and I was really mad at her, because while I was having my abortion, she went shopping. But because of what you said, my mother passed away 2 years ago. I'm not mad. Like, she went shopping. She bought herself something, and she bought me something. And that's probably the best thing that could have happened. So, okay. I probably should have told that part last, because the next part probably feels a little less. It's not very funny. So, what I want to say is the thing that I've been thinking about, and the thing that I want us to all be thinking about, is the resurgence of private eugenics. There are a multitude of ways in which birth optimization is being articulated. There are a multitude of ways in which technology, such as CRISPR technology, is being deployed unethically, for sure, but certainly for those people who are deploying that technology, which allows you to cut a gene out that creates a kind of problem, that it creates a kind of optimized human. The thing that struck me, and I don't know if people saw the article in the New Yorker magazine about CRISPR technology and the Chinese scientist who used it for what he thought was a good reason, but the last 4 lines said that the concern about this kind of technology is that it can be deployed for addressing social problems. And then 3 sentences down after that statement, it noted that a new gene had been detected for melanin. And so therefore, one might use this technology to reduce the social problem of discrimination and racism by cutting out the gene for melanin. And then there are the other ways in which eugenics is privatized through processes of embryo selection and preconception, implantation, testing, and even natal testing while one is pregnant. And so I'm going to the dark place because we are in dark times. And my hope is that we can be thinking about lives well lived, lives that deserve support, ending of lives in ways that we might want to do so, in ways, and living lives that aren't controlled by the state. These are serious times, obviously, but the notion of eugenics, genocide, bodily controls, the absence of autonomy, the ways in which we are experiencing a sort of, that we're living a kind of truncation of the ability to express ourselves is something that is of grave concern. I wish that I were a person who did research on happy topics, but I don't. So my joy is right now only being with people who are willing to think about things that are hard with me. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought that was kind of a mic drop moment, so I was going to just say thank you and move on. But I will say that I do think this has been a remarkable day. And the most powerful part of it, to me, has been the ability to hold together violence and oppression and the realities of this world with joy, celebration, and a desire for another world. And so for that, I want to say thank you to everyone. And my final words would be to together celebrate justice. Thank you.